Hello, and welcome to this IELTS academic writing preparation lesson. Today we're going to be focusing on writing task 1, and even more specifically, we're going to be focusing on bar charts. There's a lot to learn with grouping information together and really analyzing what you're given and coming up with a comprehensive outline before you write this somewhat difficult essay. So we're going to answer the most common questions when it comes to bar chart essays. I'll show you a nice guide that you can use for your own practice, and then we will go through a step-by-step example essay together. Let's get started. Now, there are 3 very common situations that you'll see when presented with a bar chart. We are not going to look at all 3 of these in this video, but we will look at 3 examples of the first example, which is bar chart with categories on the x-axis. Now, these categories can be presented in different ways. You could see percentages, you could see numbers, you could see categories. In any case, we're going to look at what to do when you see a bar chart with categories along the x-axis. And again, like I said, we'll be looking at 3 examples of this. The second type of bar chart that you are likely to see on the exam is a bar chart with dates or years on the x-axis. And the third type is looking at 2 bar charts together, and in this case you would have to compare or look at that information. Now, in order to understand this, we're going to use a general guide. This guide you can pretty much use for the writing task 1 in general. Of course, we'll have to tweak and change certain things depending on which type of graph or chart we're presented with. But on a basic level, you can expect to see 2 steps. The first step will be to analyze the chart and plan how to group the information. The most important part here is that you want to plan and analyze before you start writing your essay. A lot of students think that they have 20 minutes, and so they have to immediately start writing, and that is not the best way to do it. You want to understand your bar graph first by making an outline, and then step 2 obviously is going to be writing the essay using the recommended essay structure, and we'll go over this today. So let's look at step 1 and understand how we are going to analyze this information. Here's our guide. So again, we know that step 1 is going to be analyzing the chart, and we have 2 things to keep in mind as we are analyzing the chart, A and B. First, we want to organize the information into 2 groups. And then once we do that, we're going to find information that stands out to us. So things that are perhaps not as common, things that are quite unique to the information at hand. And then we're going to figure out the overall trend. This is still part of step 1. I'll show you in just a bit, but we're going to figure out the overall trend. So basically that means checking if there is one category that is significantly higher overall, and finding those with huge value differences and those with little differences. And these things that stand out will be noteworthy to point out in our essay. Okay, so keeping this step 1 in mind, I'm going to take you to our writing prompt today, and I'll show you how to approach these steps. Okay, so here is our writing prompt today, and it says, the chart below shows the proportion of male and female students studying 6 art-related subjects at a UK university in 2011. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features, and make comparisons where relevant. Of course, write at least 150 words. Now, the second sentence here is probably the most important. It tells you exactly what you have to do. So you have to summarize the information here by selecting and reporting the main features. Not all of the features, the main features. This is a big thing that students usually don't really pay attention to. So you don't want to write about everything. Remember, you only have 150 words as a minimum to write this. So you want to report the main features and make comparisons where relevant. Now again, we have male and female students. So male students are represented by the blue color and female by this red. And again, we have our categories on the x-axis here. So remember, our step 1 is to analyze this chart and plan how to group the information. Okay, and the best way to do this is to make an outline or to make a chart just so that it's clear to you. Of course, you don't have to have things spelled out or perfect because no one will be looking at this chart, just you. So take a look here on the left side of my chart. You have the first grouping, which is going to be your body paragraph 1, and the second grouping, which is going to be body paragraph 2. Now, obviously, you don't want to make things difficult for yourself. Go ahead and look at how the information is already grouped, and you see that we have male and female. So just to make it simple, I would start writing about male enrollment, and I'm really just going to look at the chart and understand what it says. So when I look at the male enrollment, I am looking at the blue. Now remember, you do not want to write about everything. You really just can't. So we're going to look at values that are high and values that are low. So remember from before, we're going to look at things that stand out. And so when it comes to male enrollment, the highest seems to be the English language and literature. And it also looks like communication is a close second. Then we have linguistics. So interestingly enough, it looks like these are language-based subjects because I see linguistics, English language and literature, and communication and media. So just looking at these, my analysis is that these are language-based. So I'm going to write language-based subjects, okay? And I'm going to just write out, I see English, language, and literature. And we can say that is about 230 because you see how it is right in between 200 and 250. So I've got English language and literature, 230. Secondly, I've got communication and media. That seems to be, I would say, around 210 because it's right above the 200 mark. So I'll say 210. Then we've got our third language-based, which is linguistics. And I'm going to say linguistics is around a 180. It's right in between the 150 and 200, but closer to 200. So I'll say 180. And then I'm not going to really talk about art and design and history and archaeology because those are what I would say to be mid-range. They don't have anything really to do with language-based learning, and they are not the lowest. So instead, I'm going to focus on the lowest, which is philosophy, and philosophy is clearly at 50. So philosophy, I've got 50, okay? So note how I'm looking at a couple of things. I'm looking at the highest, I am looking at the lowest, and I'm looking at the fact that there is a clear language-based grouping when it comes to male enrollment. Okay, so now we're going to look at female enrollment, which is our obvious next step. It's our second grouping, and this would be body paragraph 2. I'm going to do the same thing really. So I've got female enrollment. And again, the same thing pops up when it comes to language-based subjects. So I'm looking at English language and literature, linguistics, and communication and media. Again, just like we saw in the male enrollment, these are the highest groupings. So I'm going to basically write the same thing, change the values. So I'm looking at English, literature, and literature. For female, I see that it is right at 250. So I'm going to write 250. For communications and media studies, it looks to be around 220 because it's in between 200 and 250. And then for linguistics, I'm going to look here and it looks like it's right under 250. So it looks to be 240. Then again, analyzing the trend, I am not really going to talk about philosophy or art and design because again, these are mid-range. Instead, I'm going to look at the lowest, and that seems to be history and archaeology at just over 100, looks like 120 right here. So I'll just say history and archaeology, and again, 120. And there we have it. That is our step 1. So if you remember from our slide earlier, what we've basically just done is analyzed the chart and planned out how to group the information by organizing the information into 2 groups. We've got our first grouping and our second grouping, and then we found information that stands out. So notice how we didn't talk about things that were mid-range. We just found things that were interesting. Okay, so I'm going to take you here on the right-hand side for our next portion of step 1, which is to figure out the overall trend. And remember, there are 2 ways to do this. First, we're going to check if there is one category that is significantly higher overall, and significantly is a very important word here. And two, we're going to find those with huge value differences, and again, those with little value differences. Now let's just take a closer look here at our chart, and let's approach the first option here. So we have to check to see if there's one category that is significantly higher overall. Now, when it comes to male enrollment, we see here that art and design is the only time that male enrollment is higher than female enrollment. So if you look here, the red, which designates female enrollment, is always higher. And this is something to make note of. We see that female enrollment is higher in all subjects except obviously art and design. So art and design is going to be an important point to talk about. And this is a very clear trend that we need to put in our overview paragraph. Okay, so that is our one category that is significantly higher, or that is quite interesting overall. Now, second, we're going to find those with a huge value difference and those with a little value difference. And so it seems to be that 5 out of 6 subjects have honestly a relatively equal amount of enrolled students. So if you look here, we have communication and media studies, that's pretty much the same, as is art and design. History and archaeology are quite similar. English language and literature are definitely quite similar. And linguistics, when looking at the whole thing, these are actually also quite similar. The only subject that has quite a large difference is philosophy, because we see that 50 males are enrolled, whereas 150 females are enrolled. So this is a clear difference of 100. And this large gender gap is also another clear trend that we can put into our overview paragraph. So we're going to make a note of this as well. Okay, so now that we have done our first step, let's take a look at our second step and the outline we're going to use for actually writing this essay. Now remember, our step 2 is quite simply writing an essay using the recommended essay structure, and that structure is as follows. We are going to start thinking about our outline and our paragraphs. So take a look at this structure. We have the first part, obviously the introduction. Then we have our overview paragraph, body paragraph 1, and body paragraph 2. This is what you should be following for the most part when it comes to writing task 1, and especially this specific type of example with categories along the x-axis. So just to go into more detail, in your introduction, you will want to paraphrase the task question. You don't want to get too inventive here. You just want to make sure that you're following the rules and adding a nice introduction that will talk about the writing prompt you have. Secondly, you want to write about the overall trend. So this was something we looked at in step 1. And then for body paragraph 2, you'll want to write about the first group, which in this case will be male enrollment. And then of course, as you may have guessed, body paragraph 2 will be about the second group, which in this case will be female enrollment. So there you have it. We've already looked at our overview, and we've looked at these 2 different groups in our outline in step 1. So let's go ahead and start writing our essay and finish up with step 2. Okay, so now it's time to write our essay. And on the right-hand side, you see that I have the headings of what we've just looked at for the outline. So we have the introduction, overview, body paragraph 1, and body paragraph 2. Obviously, when you are writing this in your own practice or during the exam, you do not want to write these headings. I'm only doing this here to give you an idea of where we are when we start writing. So let's start with the introduction. Remember, we're just going to paraphrase. And so I have our writing prompt here. Now I'm just going to basically say this in a different way. So I'm going to say the bar chart shows the distribution of students by gender across 6 art-based disciplines at a UK university in 2011. Now, this is my paraphrasing, basically. I see here that it says the chart. So I said the bar chart because we know it is a bar chart. And it says it shows the proportion of male and female students. I said shows the distribution of students by gender. So this is a different way to say the proportion of male and female students across 6 art-based disciplines. So I don't want to change art because I know that it is art-based. It's just a different way to say art-related, but I do want to include that detail. And instead of subjects, I have disciplines. Of course, I've kept the fact that it is a UK university, and I have kept the date as well. So that is your first sentence. It just really introduces things on a professional level and does not introduce anything strange or creative. Now, for the overview, remember, we're going to write the overall trend, which is what we have just looked at. So I'm going to start with a nice overview, a nice way to introduce everything. And I'm going to say, generally speaking, the chart shows that while females outnumber males in most disciplines, the gender gap for each subject was not significant, with the notable exception of philosophy. Okay, and remember, we were looking at this in the last step. We saw that females outnumbered males for the most part everywhere except for art and design, which I will talk about when we get to males. But we see here the gender gap for each student was not significant, except for this notable difference that we looked at in the overall trend step of philosophy. So I'm just going to add on here about philosophy. I'm going to say where female students, we could say here, outnumbered their male counterparts by almost 3 to 1. Okay, and so I've looked at this 3 to 1 basically because I see this as quite an even number here. We have 150 female students and 50 male students. And so basically I've just divided 150 by 50 and I've gotten 3. So I'm no math whiz, I am an English teacher, but you can use this to see the ratio, and that is why I've put 3 to 1 instead of any other percentage or using 150 versus 50. So that is my overview. That is the general trend. All right, so just like that, we are on to our body paragraph 1, which is where we're going to start talking about male enrollment. So that is our first group, and remember that's the blue, and I've got our first grouping, body paragraph 1, exactly here in our outline. So I'm going to use this to write my paragraph. So I'm just going to start off by saying, regarding male enrollment, art and design was the only subject with more men than women at a ratio of 120 to 90. And this is exactly what we looked at in our previous step. And just from having studied math and having looked at ratios, this is about a 25% decrease. So we see that females account for about 25% less than male students here. So I've gone ahead and used a ratio again. And I'm going to then build upon this by looking at our outline. And I'm going to say language-based subjects. And we'll look at our options here. It says namely linguistics, English language, and literature, and communication and media studies were the most popular subjects for male students. And that is exactly what we saw here in our outline. And then I'm just going to say the least, which would be philosophy. Again, I want to show a bigger gap. So I would say the least attracted subject for males was philosophy, with only 50 students enrolled. Okay, and that is exactly what we had for our outline. It is concise, it is to the point. And now we've got our body paragraph 2, which is just going to talk about our second grouping, which is the female enrollment. So I'm going to shift gears and say, looking specifically at female enrolled numbers, a higher proportion of females enrolled more than males across 5 of the 6 subjects. And that is also something we saw in our overview. We could see here, like men, female students are also drawn to language-based subjects. Now I'm including this because I want to also compare a bit the male and female enrollment, and that is true from looking at our graph. And I'll say here, of these, English language and literature was the most popular subject with an enrollment of 250 students. And again, we had that in our outline. Last thing I'm going to talk about is just the history and archaeology point here. And I will go ahead and say, with regard to the least attractive subject, history and archaeology had only less than 100 female students taking part. And there we have it. We've talked about our female enrollment. So notice how I talked about everything we wrote in our outline, everything from the second part of the first step. Now let's take a look at the language and just analyze why I used certain wording. Okay, and so I've cleaned it up a little bit. We see that our word count is 186, which is perfect. We had a 150 word minimum, so we have met that, and we haven't gone too far over, so we've definitely spent the right amount of time on this. Now in color coding, I have functional language in red, useful vocabulary and phrases in green, and synonyms and topic vocabulary in blue. This will really depend on how much you are prepared in terms of your vocabulary and your synonyms, and basically all of your language acquisition prior to the exam. So make sure you're studying up on great phrases, especially for technical language and scientific writing. But basically, if we start with our red, so our functional language, these phrases really help open up your paragraph, combine ideas, and also look at details. So generally speaking, obviously, is something to start with. It introduces a wide topic, with the notable exception of is great when talking about those big differences and those big gaps, just like we did for philosophy. Regarding male enrollment is a great way to specifically look at one of the groups, or you could also say looking specifically at. The important thing is that you have two ways to say that and you're not sounding monotonous. Then again, we have with regard to. Again, it's just another way to connect your ideas and again, just show more detail. Now for useful vocabulary and phrases in green, these are specifically for writing task 1. So we see outnumber quite a bit, and you want to use outnumbered by. So make sure you have these two words together at a ratio of, so make sure you have these words together, and a higher proportion of. Make sure you understand which prepositions are going with which phrases, because this will really help your score. And then synonyms and topic vocabulary are things that are specifically applicable to this example. So we've got gender, we have gender gap, and notice here that in our writing prompt, nothing was really discussed with the word gender. We only saw male and female. So the fact that we used gender and gender gap would show the examiner that we have great synonyms and that we don't have to keep repeating male and female. Then again, we have male enrollment. That is very specific, as well as language-based subjects. This is something that we did not see in the prompt. In the prompt, we saw art-related subjects, but language-based is quite specific. And the fact that we've hyphenated it shows that it is an adjective. So we have used an adjective correctly. We've hyphenated it correctly. These are also great for your scoring. And of course, we have enrollment. Taking part is also a great verb phrase. Basically means participating in. But the more you use these great verb phrases, the more your examiner will understand that you've got a great vocabulary acquisition. Now, when it comes to scoring, remember we have 4 things to look at. Task achievement. So basically we have achieved the task at hand because we have answered this writing prompt. We've written at least 150 words, and we have really talked about the main features of this bar chart. Our coherence and cohesion is perfect because we used our outline correctly. So we have a very nice introduction, an overview, and then we've gone into detail with our 2 groups. And then our lexical resource and our grammatical range and accuracy is really just noted here with this color coding, with this red, green, and blue. We have definitely used things that work with this topic and also great connectives. So this is a really high scoring essay. And just keep in mind that all of these steps, starting from the outline stage to the essay writing, have really made this a success. Okay, so without further ado, let's look at part 2. We're going to speed things up a bit and look at a different example. And then again, we will go through it together step by step. All right, so we've got our second example here, very similar to the first example, but we're going to be paying attention to percentages here. So again, let's look at our prompt. It says the chart illustrates the percentage of male and female executives in 6 different types of professions across the UK in 2007. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where necessary. Of course, we'll have to write 150 words as a minimum. So again, we're looking at percentages here, but we are still going to use the same method that we looked at in the first example. So for our step 1, we're going to analyze this chart and plan how to group the information based on our 2 groups. So I've got our male jobs and our female jobs. Now I've already written out some of the most noteworthy positions, and I'll show you why. Now for male jobs, remember we have the blue bar here. We're looking at construction, scientists, and teaching. This is because this is the most noteworthy. So if we look, for example, at construction, we've got 90% of males in that sector. So I'm going to write 90% here. Scientists was also quite high compared to everything else. It was the second highest, so I'm going to include that at 60%. And now you'll see that I've included teaching. That's because it is the lowest. So I've got about 10% here. We could also say 1 in 10, which we'll look at in our essay, but I've got 10%. So note that I've included the 2 highest and the lowest. I'm going to do the same thing for female jobs, and we're not going to pay attention to the mid-range because that isn't a main feature. Remember, we have to pay attention to these main features. So for female jobs in teaching, it looks like we have 90%, just like construction for males. So I'm going to go ahead and write 90% for teaching. For therapists, that is the second highest for female. That looks to be right around 80%. I'll put something like 80, it looks like 82, and we can figure that out as we're writing the essay, but it's right above 80. And then the lowest for female jobs looks to be construction, and that is right at 10%, just like teaching was for male employment. So that is our lovely table here. We have grouped the information, we've analyzed the chart, and remember, we're looking for the most noteworthy. So the highest, the lowest, we don't really want to look at mid-range right now in this step. Now remember, for our second part of step 1, we need to figure out the overall trend. So we have to check if there is one category that is significantly higher overall. And so let's just make some notes here. I'm going to use a star for the female jobs, and it looks like advertising, teaching, and therapists are the 3 areas where females have a larger percentage. Now for males, I'm going to use a check mark, and for males, it looks like construction, which is here. We have scientists, and the last one, law. These are the 3 areas where males have a higher percentage. When it comes to equal, I'll use an arrow for this, it looks like we have journalism with equal male and female percentage. So basically from this step, do we see a higher trend or a clear trend? Not necessarily. No clear trend is really available here. We're just able to see that there are some female-dominated and some male-dominated jobs. So I'm going to move on to step 2. I'm going to look at those with huge value differences and those with little value differences. And basically what you see here is there is such a large gap when it comes to 3 of these sectors. So teaching, construction, and therapists. Look at these really wide gaps here. This is what you want to write about. There really isn't any use writing about the journalism sector, scientists, law, or advertising because they're quite similar. You want to focus on this trend in your overview paragraph, the fact that there are such large gaps. So this is definitely something a trend that we can include in our overview paragraph. And then, of course, in our 2 body paragraphs, we'll include this information about male jobs and female jobs. Now let's look at our model essay. Okay, and again, I have split up our words into red, green, and blue. Again, our word count is 180 words, which is a great area to be at. Let's go ahead and look at this essay. So for our introduction, we have that paraphrase statement, and it says, the chart compares the percentage of male and female professionals in 7 widely different career settings from advertising to law in 2007. Now, professionals is a great topic word here. We have executives and professions. So we've just used a synonym. We've said professionals. And I've used an example of advertising and law. Even though it's not in our prompt, it's in our chart. And it's great to just add some detail here. Of course, we have the year as well. Now, overall is a great functional word for the overview paragraph. It says overall, in roughly half of the occupations given, both genders were approximately equally represented, which is pretty much true, which we saw here. However, in traditionally gender-dominated professions, such as teaching, construction, and therapists, gender gaps still exist. So we see that these 3 trends that we looked at, these large gaps, are gender-dominated, and gender-dominated is a great way to say that there are more females or males in that area. Now we've got our paragraph 1 looking at male jobs. Again, we have a great phrase from the outset. There were dramatically more men than women in the traditionally male-dominated fields of construction and science, with males making up 90% and 60% of jobs there, respectively. Now we've got making up as a great phrasal verb, and the fact that we see respectively shows 90% for construction and 60% for scientists. On the contrary, which is a great functional word to talk about a contradiction, only 1 in 10 men hold positions in teaching jobs. The only field with men holding exactly the same number of positions as women was journalism, which we looked at in our preparation step. Now we've got our last paragraph here. Again, we've got looking specifically at, which is a great functional word to look at detail. Looking specifically at female professions, women held more jobs in the stereotypical female jobs of teaching and therapy. Women dominated the former field, accounting for 90% of all positions in teaching, and therapy was similar, with women holding 82% of all jobs as opposed to 18% of men. Accounting for is a great, useful vocabulary when it comes to writing task 1. And just keep in mind here, when I looked at therapy, I said around 80 here, but I looked closely, it's 82. So you would not be incorrect to write 82. And I've also estimated for males in that sector at around 18%. In contrast, which is great, similar to on the contrary, females only held 10% of jobs in the male-dominated construction field, which we saw here in our overview. So note how the overview and the 2 groupings really helped us write this. Again, when it comes to task achievement, we were able to fit everything in with a minimum of 150 words. It's very cohesive and coherent thanks to our outline. Everything is very clear. And these color-coded words show the lexical resource and the grammatical range. You might see this as well. It's basically a reversed bar graph. So we've still got our categories that we'll have to understand, but you will see your percentages, what looks like the x-axis, but really you should be thinking about this as we did in the previous 2 examples with our categories, which here are cities, along the x-axis. So let's go ahead and look at our prompt. It says, the chart below gives some of the most reported issues among people living in UK cities in 2008 in percentages. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. Write at least 150 words. Now, this is probably the trickiest example, but it's best if you actually sort of combine steps 1 and 2, because it really isn't that difficult. So if you just look at this, it's very, very clear that air pollution is the lowest amount. So it's got the lowest percentage, and health services and education and training are quite similar and really high, especially when compared to air pollution. So it's very clear that you want to group health services and education and training together, and then group air pollution in its own category. And just by grouping it and looking at these vast differences, you're already looking at the second part of step one, which is checking to see if there's one category that is significantly higher, or looking at those value differences. You can basically do this at the same time in an example like this. So in our first grouping, we've got health services and education training. If you see health services, which I've abbreviated to HS, it's blue, it is the highest percentage when it comes to 5 cities. So we see Newcastle, Belfast, Birmingham, Cardiff, and Manchester. And then for education and training, that is the highest percentage in 2 cities, that is Glasgow and London. So these are things to keep in mind. This is what we're going to write about. And it's also a very clear trend. So notice how our information from the first grouping will also help us understand large value differences. And again, for our second grouping, we've got air pollution. Now, in all cities, air pollution has a very small percentage of living issues. And this in and of itself is a very clear trend. So we're going to include all of this information in our overview paragraph. And basically, when it comes to the groupings, I'm just going to talk about the individual cities when it comes to health services and education. And when it comes to air pollution, I'm going to talk about the 3 cities that have more than 10% of a concern with air pollution, and that would be Cardiff, Manchester, and London. And just to show you here with a little stamp, I'll use an X to talk about cities that are over 50% when it comes to concerns for health services. And I'll also make a note in my body paragraph 1 of where education and training was actually higher than health services concerns. So by just looking at this, even though it looks like it might be a more difficult example because you see a lot more values, it's actually quite easy because you're able to group the 2 sections of step 1 and really kill 2 birds with 1 stone here, because you can find overall trends and understand your details all in one. Okay, and here we have our model essay. So let's go through this together. I've got our words color-coded so that we can understand what works best here. And let's start with our introduction. Now you'll see here that I just paraphrased what we see in our prompt. And it says, the chart illustrates several important living issues faced by inhabitants of 7 major UK cities. And I've listed the cities in 2008. Units are given in percentages. So I have used the word inhabitants quite a bit in this essay, just because it's a great way to say people who are living in various cities. They live there, they are inhabitants. And for our overview, it's basically what we talked about here. It says overall, which is a great way to talk about an overview, health services proved to be the most important living issue in most cities, which is exactly what we said, with education and training a close second. This is a great way to say that something is not too far behind. And then we have least worrisome of all to UK residents was air pollution that year. It's very specific because we're talking about 2008, which on average seemed to be around 5 times less important to city populations there. Now, it's 5 times less just because I've looked at the percentages. We've got around 50 and around 10. So just from looking at math, that would be 5 times. Of course, we're just estimating here, which is why I have on average, which is another great phrase. Now I'm going to look at the health services and education training in this paragraph. I have regarding health services. In 5 of the 7 cities, over 50% of city residents stated it as their #1 living issue. And that is true. I've talked about all 5, even though I highlighted these 3 in my notes. This was especially true in Belfast and Cardiff, where almost 60% of inhabitants were troubled. And education and training fell to a close second for all city populations, with a less than 10% difference between the two results, which is true because you see that these are all less than 10%, with the exception of Glasgow and London, and I've included those percentages as well, where it had become the biggest problem. So you see how I'm able to talk about when education was higher than health services. And our last paragraph is all about air pollution. With respect to air pollution, only Manchester, I've got their percentage, London and Cardiff had more than 10% of their inhabitants concerned. So I've used my 3 cases here. Least of all worried about air pollution were those in Newcastle. So I'm looking at this as well, of whom only 5% of people stated this as an issue. Now, I looked at this because it is the least amount, so it is something interesting to add. And that got me at my word count of 196. That's a great place to stop. You don't want to go too much over 200 in writing task 1. And we've definitely fulfilled everything. So our task achievement has been fulfilled because we've looked at the trends, we've looked at the specifics. Our coherence and cohesion, just like our other 2 examples, is very clear thanks to our outline and the way we've organized everything. It's very clear. And our lexical resource and grammar is highlighted in these color codes. Note how I used the past perfect. So whenever you can, try to use as many grammatical forms as possible. All right, excellent job today. Let's wrap up quickly. I'll leave you with some do's and don'ts. Of course, you want to analyze your chart. That's the first thing you want to do when you see your writing prompt. Analyze your chart, plan how to group the information into 2 groups, and then look for trends. You want to look for huge value differences and little value differences, and this is what you will include in your overview. Then you want to organize your essay accordingly. So remember, we had an introduction sentence, the overview paragraph, body paragraph 1, and body paragraph 2. If you stick to this format, you will not get confused, you will not confuse your examiner, and you will not write more or less than you need to. So make sure you stick to this organization. For things you don't want to do, definitely don't start writing the essay immediately. You want to take that time to plan and really analyze your graph. If you don't do that, you're not going to know what to write. So don't write the wrong amount. You want to stick to 150 words minimum. Don't go too far over that. You see how our highest today was around 190. That's about as far as you want to go. And do not get confused over reversed graphs like our last 3rd example. In some ways, this can actually be easier for you because you can plan how to group the information and look for trends at the same time. All right, excellent job today. I hope you will visit us at www.bestmytest.com/IELTS. There we've got a lot of practice, and we also have videos for the 2 other types of bar charts that you will come across. So go ahead and check us out. We'll be there waiting for you so that you can further develop your IELTS skills. Thanks again. Have a great day.